Hoş geldiniz. Asolis Laboratuvarı'nın etkinliklerinden daha beraberiz. Bugünkü misafirimiz Martin McMullan. Kendisi Kuzey İrlanda'da bulunan YouthAction'da yardımcı direktör olarak 20 yılı aşkın süredir çalışmalarını sürdürüyor. Kendisi araştırmalar da yapıyor, araştırma geliştirme alanında da çalışıyor, eğitici eğitimi, kaynak geliştirme alanlarında da faaliyetlerini sürdürüyor. McMullan, Kıbrıs, Lefkoşa'da, Güney Afrika'da, Hırvatistan'da da gençlerin barış inşasına katılımı konularında çalışmalarda da bulunmuş. Bugün kendisi bizimle Kuzey İrlanda'da gençlerle yaptıkları projeler konusunda tecrübelerini paylaşacak. Kendisini dinliyoruz. The floor is yours, Martin. Thank you.
Okay.
Welcome.
Thank you, Aylin. Thank you to everybody for coming here this evening. And a very special thanks to the Hrant Dink Foundation for inviting me to Istanbul for my very first visit. So I really like the city so far. I am here based on some work that the Hrant Dink Foundation came to Northern Ireland, to Belfast and to Dublin in August of this year through NIAD. So myself and NIAD met in Belfast, and I'd just like to say thank you for the invite to come here this evening. Is my pace okay? Yep. Okay. So I'll introduce myself and a little bit about how this will work, but we will do some slides, some input, some sharing, and myself and Aylin then will stop for some questions and answers and maybe some conversation if that's okay, and then followed by more slides and things. Yep. And I might stand, because I like to stand. Okay, so I suppose first of all, who I am. My name is Martin McMullan, and I'm the Assistant Director for YouthAction Northern Ireland. So I work for a youth work organisation, so working with young people through informal education. My experience for over 21 years has been peace building work with young people, primarily with young people, but our organisation also works with local community groups, capacity building. We also do resource development, as Aylin has said. We also do training. And part of our role as an organisation, as an NGO, is to influence policy as well. So this evening I'm going to share a little bit with you about how Northern Ireland remains a divided society. We still have undertones of conflict. The conflict has not gone away, even though we have had a peace process of over 20 years. So I want to share with you just some findings from both my practice but also my PhD research that I carried out at the University of Southampton. More importantly is to look at our society in Northern Ireland and also understand how does that affect the lives of children and young people in our society and their lived realities, their everyday world. I also want to share with you then some small examples of peace building work that we do, and then to end on just a model of intervention in terms of informal interventions with young people. Have people been to Ireland or Northern Ireland? Is there a show of hands? A few people? Just one, two, three. Okay, so fabulous place. No, it's great. So I was born in Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland itself is it's not even 100 years old. So Northern Ireland only came into being in 1921. So you all know about Titanic. The Titanic ship was built in Belfast, but it didn't leave Northern Ireland, it left Ireland. So there was no Northern Ireland in 1912, for example. So we're still quite a new place, Northern Ireland, in terms of our identity, who we are. So therein lies the problem. Who exactly are we? And I'll take you through a little bit of some of the complexities of that. So over here we can obviously see, and I presume people know roughly the area, so apologies if this is information you already know, but it's just to set the context a little bit. So Ireland and Northern Ireland as a whole, one complete island here with different counties. This yellow section is called Ulster, and it is made up of 9 counties, 9 territories, 9 counties in Ireland. However, 6 of these are over here, and these 6 counties of Antrim, Down, Antrim, Down, Derry, Tyrone, Fermanagh, etc., are all in what has become known as Northern Ireland, so a divided place. So this is our border that runs through Ireland, right up to here. So this part of Ireland is actually in the south, even though it's more north. But this is Donegal, beautiful place to go. So Belfast, if we're looking at this, is located in this area. So YouthAction, the organisation I work for, we have bases all around. We would be in Belfast, we were in the border here in Uri-Mourne, we'd be in Fermanagh, we're also in Armagh, and we're in Derry. That's where our organisation is placed. So primarily what I'm saying is we have been left with a legacy of division in our society for lots of different reasons, but part of that has been based on colonialism in the first instance, and the role of the British in Ireland during the 16th and 17th century, if not before. So it's left with it a legacy of difference and different identities. So of people who identify with being Irish, or people who identify with being British. So often the problem in Northern Ireland is perceived to be about Protestant and Catholic, which all fall obviously under Christianity. So what you hear in the news reports are about Protestants and Catholics fighting, and Protestants and Catholics not liking each other. To some degree that is true, but it's more closely associated with your ethno-national identification. So Catholics are more likely to be nationalist or Republican and identify with being Irish, whereas Protestants are more likely to be unionist, loyalist, and to identify with Britain. So that's part of our problem, and that consists today. So we had a Good Friday Agreement, or peace agreement, in 1998, and often that is celebrated by different writers and commentators as one of the most significant peace agreements in modern time. It was fantastic to move from ceasefire to no bombs to no military presence anymore in our land. However, this is today, this is not 1998. So for example, these are peace lines that exist in Belfast today. So in 1998, we had 47, 48 peace lines of these type of peace lines. Today, in 2018, we have double that amount. So we have about 90, 92, 94 peace lines across our city. So they don't all look like this. They might be a wee bit more discreet, or they might be more interface communities where you have a business enterprise set up between the communities to keep them apart. But the reality is people do live on either side of these walls. So Protestant and Catholic communities continue to live like this, mostly in urban settings, it has to be said. In rural settings, it's more nuanced. It's more subtle. It's not as obvious. As well, in terms of the separation and segregation in Northern Irish society, we have wall murals. We have lots of beautiful displays of wall murals. One Aylin had shared with me today, just not so far from my house in Belfast, says, "Prepared for peace, ready for war." So we're prepared for peace, but ready for war. And it's a picture of like militant activity with a gun, a man with a gun, to be precise. Very much like these. This is an Irish Republican wall mural. So in the Irish community, you would say Choque ar lá, which means our day will come. And our day will come is reflective of the Irish community in the north of Ireland looking for reunification, looking for the reunification of Ireland into one state. However, on the other side of the house you have over here, we have the fist up saying, "No, we shall never surrender." So from the loyalist community side of the house, you know, you're entering a loyalist heartland, and it's we will remain united with the United Kingdom. We will remain loyal to the United Kingdom. So, I want to just give you a brief outline on how does, bar that physicality, how does it look in everyday life for people growing up in Northern Ireland? So just two examples I'm going to give are education. So our education system, so schooling, about approximately 94% of our children and young people go to separate schools. So 94% of children and young people either go to a Catholic school or go to a Protestant school. So they're siloed. So that leaves only 6% of our young people going to an integrated school. So in one sense that's okay, because it's up to parental choice which school a young person goes to, but it means that for roughly 14 years of a young person's life, they have not met the other community. They have been siloed. They operate in their silos and they do not come into contact with a young person from the other community. So I think that's a problem. The OECD report of 2002 noted that the schooling system in Northern Ireland was the most socially segregated in the developed world, being 34th out of 34. So we have our education system which is separate, but we also have housing which is separate. So it's not just the education system. So young people come home from school and they come into segregated communities based on their ethno-religious identity. So up to 95% of social housing is identifiable by your religion. So young people are growing up in separate communities and having separate education. So one of the areas that I work in, on the border, we carried out research over the last 3 years, and over 47% of young people aged 16 had never met somebody from the other community. So nearly half of the population had never met a Catholic or never met a Protestant. So again, we have peace in Northern Ireland, but this doesn't look like peace to me. This looks like separation. And again, something we need to consider. So the impact of all this is multiple, but you know, we have writers here who talk about communities living in bubble syndromes, like living in a bubble. You don't get outside of that bubble, you just identify with your own, you socialize with your own, you go to school with your own, you have relationships with in-group. But also we have bounded contentment. And bounded contentment really talks about that people are happy with that, and that there's no contamination into their community, or there's no fear of meeting the other. We're okay on our little patch. We don't have to meet the other community, and we're safe without having to come into contact with them. So people can be quite content with the way things are and with the status quo, or the status quo. But really importantly for me as a youth worker who cares about young people, but also who cares as a peace builder and how we move forward, young people do not get to meet one another, never mind to form, develop and sustain relationships with one another. We also then have this insularity and reduced horizons. So these bubble syndromes and the threat of Brexit in terms of Britain coming out of the European Union and Northern Ireland being part of the United Kingdom coming out of the European Union, we're really worried in our society about borders being re-brought back into our community. 20 years ago, as part of the Good Friday Agreement, our borders came down, it was demilitarised, and now with Brexit, we have the potential of borders going back up again because of the relationship with Ireland, who are in the European Union, and as being part of the United Kingdom, we will not be in the European Union. So we are worried about how our society, again, becomes really insular and becomes very inward-looking and just not really respecting difference and diversity. Okay, so a few things just to note here around sectarianism. Is that a word that people would be familiar with? Sectarianism, yep. So Duncan Morrow at home would talk about it being around about hostility. And it's also about aggression and mistrust and distrust and actually dislike of the outgroup or dislike of the other community. There's this outgroup rejection. You reject the outgroup at all costs. You're protecting your own community and protecting your own identity. So sometimes this is very, very visible, and it can erupt at times when situations are very volatile. And that's when you see it most, is this sectarianism, where it plays out in terms of the prejudice or the discrimination towards the other religion or ethno-national identity. In terms of our policing in Northern Ireland, which were formerly called the Royal Ulster Constabulary, as part of the peace agreement, we had to go through a whole reconfiguration of our policing system to become the policing system of Northern Ireland. which was more reflective of both the Catholic and Protestant community. Today, our PSNI is made up of 20% Catholic and 80% Protestant. So we still have a long way to go to have a more reflective policing system as well. However, they report that, this was in 2013-14, but it's still the same today, that the #1 hate crime, and it's really interesting when we talk about hate and as a word and how that transcends in everyday society, but that sectarianism is the #1 hate crime in Northern Ireland. So dislike of the other community is very visible. So I'll talk to you just a little bit about what does this mean for young people, and then we'll take a little breather and we'll have a little chat together, and then we'll come back to some more. So what does this all mean for young people? One of my research questions in carrying out my PhD at the University of Southampton was about how relevant is sectarianism and separation in the lives of young people. So the study involved focus groups with 39 young people and gathering data through youth workers in my organisation with about 400 young people. So it was a lot of data to analyse, but it gave us insight into how young people are feeling. And I suppose the first thing I would say, I'm not sure how it would be in Turkey, but if you ask young people, what is your #1 issue going on for you? What is the #1 issue if you're carrying out an assessment of need? The first answer is often not the conflict or the troubles. It becomes, it's about mental health, it's about anxiety, it's about stress, it's about a sense of belonging, a sense of becoming. These types of issues are the issues that young people identify. So often a researcher or a youth worker would accept that at face value and say then, okay, the conflict isn't actually a priority issue. But through a little bit more depth and delving with young people, it becomes very clear and very apparent the things that they can and cannot do. So when you start to talk to them about, can you meet a young woman or a young man from the other community and have a relationship? If you ask them questions like, can you move about without feeling fear? Can you travel through the other community? These types of questions, they start to get it. They actually start to go, I know what you're talking about now. So young people can actually identify how the conflict actually affects all their choices and their behaviours. The thing I suppose to be careful about as workers, it's not a hierarchy or a competition for what's your #1 issue. They're all interconnected. So when young people talk about anxiety or mental health, it's often transgenerational issues of conflict and anxiety that have passed from their parents. So people of my age who lived through the conflict would perhaps say to their children, just you be careful. Don't you be going over there late at night. Don't you be going over to that other community. Be very careful. Because we've experienced it, and we would worry about children and young people, that we recite these things. So young people feel our anxieties and in turn live those out. These are just some examples of what young people have said in my research to give you a sort of a feel of what they were talking about. So quote #1, I take the long way home to avoid the others. You can feel a change in the atmosphere. So this is this thing of noticing. Young people notice things and feel things that sometimes we as adults don't see or don't experience. They're much more susceptible to it. They have this precautionary principle that we talked about earlier, Aylin, as well. Young people operate with this precautionary principle of just in case. You know, always looking over your shoulder. I'm always looking over my shoulder to see if there's a risk or if I am vulnerable or the risk of violence. Second quote from a young Catholic, I wouldn't go into a Protestant community, especially not in a uniform, that's a school uniform, especially not in a uniform or anything else that would identify me as a Catholic. So by going to separate schools, as I said at the start, so 94% of young people going to separate schools, your school uniform is an identifier of, it's visible. You're Catholic, there's a Protestant, because you know by the school uniform. So young people are very susceptible to that risk at an everyday level from the age of 4, right through to their roughly 17 years of age. There are other identifiers, not just clothing, but also your accent, you know, where you're from. Another identifier would be your name. So if I met you for the first time and you tell me you're called William, I am most likely to think that you're a Protestant from, or aligning with Britain. If you say your name's Sean or Paddy, I'm more likely to think you're a Catholic. But that's again the reality, and I know it's the same here in some ways as well. So names are very much an identifier. But a really interesting one that we have is the 8th letter of our alphabet, which is the letter H. So A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. When we were growing up, and young people still today, they ask you to go, spell happy. And if I say H, A-P-P-Y, I would be a Catholic. And if I say H, it's slightly different twang, A-P-P-Y, you're a Protestant. And I know it sounds bizarre, but that's how we live. And a guy called Frank Burton would talk about that as being the telling process of how we can tell very, very quickly, within 2 minutes of meeting somebody, what religious background they're from. Okay, so a third quote from young people. We're not really living in peace. We're still quite separate. But it's not really affecting us directly, so there's not much that we can do. So this is an interesting one because there's sometimes a wee bit of a, it happened 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. It doesn't really affect us. This was your problem, and we don't want to be burdened with your problem and your responsibility, and society has changed. And yes, society has changed with no helicopters in the sky, no British Army presence, no borders. I was going to say no guns, but there are guns. But they don't see it in the same way, and they don't see what a lot of the rest of the community went through. Now, it's not our responsibility to keep bringing it up and going, let's talk about the conflict, let's talk about the troubles, let's talk about what the British did, let's talk about what the IRA did. It's not about that, it's about the reality of their everyday lives, and that they can actually start to see how the conflict does affect them, that they can't move from community to community so freely as they think. So a young person in a Catholic area here in Belfast, working with me now, he was working in an off licence, selling alcohol, but the job, so he was a Catholic called Paddy. So Paddy steps over into the Protestant community, probably about 10 footsteps away. So he goes over here to work in that community in an off licence. First thing, he has to change his name. So he can't be called Paddy. So it was changed to something like George. So that was very difficult. So he changed his name to George and thought, this is a wee bit odd. But the people in his own community weren't happy with him working there either. So they threatened him and said, you need to actually be in your own community. So it's not so easy to be mobile and move across from community to community as people might think. Okay, a few more. It doesn't affect me. I'm living in fear. So the paradox of that, so in the same quote, the young person said, it doesn't affect me, I'm living in fear. So again, this is about the conscious and the subconscious levels at which it takes place in Northern Ireland. We are encouraged to be sectarian through ignorance from our parents. So again, family influences and rituals and symbolism and triumphalism and commemorations by parents reinforces to young people their own identity, and also, in fact, celebrates violence a lot of the time. In the Protestant community, they would have on the 12th of July an orange parade that runs through our society, and it's celebrating King William's victory over King James. And King William, Protestant, King James, Catholic. So it's celebrating a Protestant victory and a Catholic defeat. And that's very hard for, so Protestants are learning that triumphalism and victorious type nature. And then from the Catholic community, it's provocative and very offending as well. So it's very hard to kind of infiltrate at that level. Having new friendships breaks the separation in some ways. So this is about people coming into contact. So if young people haven't come into contact by the age of 16 years, they're going to carry prejudices and mistrust in later life. So, but young people themselves are saying that we in society as adults, as educators, youth workers, need to help young people to create new friendships. And it's not just tokenistic friendships, it's meaningful and sustained contact as well that young people talk about. And the last one here, the conflict happened, but you don't talk about it. So young people are aware in Northern Ireland that something did take place, but who's opening up that conversation with them about what happened? So history books in school go back to the 16th century, the 17th century, look at British-Irish history, but they don't talk an awful lot about the current conflict, the conflict of the last 30 years. And it's not that we should be having a history lesson with young people, but again, just helping to understand perspectives on, I heard this, my mummy told me this, my granny told me that, and that each side of the community can hear from one another. Again, it's not to live in the conflict and to live in the past. It's finding those moments where you can actually have those conversations with young people and not ignore it. So to give some examples here, I mean, I was quite shocked by this, but I haven't been affected by the conflict, was what young people said to me most of the time. But again, through further depth and exploration, I haven't been affected by the conflict, but I wouldn't wear Reebok trainers. So a pair of Reebok trainers, and I was like, I don't understand that. What's that got to do with anything? And it was a young Catholic said that they wouldn't wear Reebok trainers because on the back of the heel is a small Union Jack flag from Britain, and they would be worried that that Union flag would be an identifier as a Protestant. So that was a risk. Another young person, I haven't been affected by the conflict, but I wouldn't go to, I'm trying to think of my destinations, Santa Ponsa. Okay, and I was going, okay, so where do you go to? So I go to Malaga. So both Malaga and Santa Ponsa are close to each other in Spain. So again, I don't understand what's the difference. So the young person who wouldn't go to Santa Ponsa was saying that that's a place, it's more Irish. They're more of the Irish community go there for their holiday, whereas in Malaga, it's more of a British destination. So again, young people were hearing things and believing things, whether they were true or not. Actually, a really concerning one recently was a project which brought young Catholics and Protestants together around the age of 16, 17, 18. And so a young woman, Protestant woman on that program was really enjoying being part of the project and getting so much out of meeting new friends. But some of her friends from the Protestant community challenged her and asked her to leave the program and said, "You're not a real Protestant. So real Protestants can't interact with Catholics. So if you continue in that program, we're not going to be your friend." And I admire her courage. She remained on that project. And her true friends, by the way, remained in her life, whereas some sort of dissipated. But again, that's the reality. It's not so easy to come together. So we'll stop just after these couple of slides here. So the impact of this is really, really pronounced in terms of, you know, feelings of uncertainty and insecurity. So the peace agreement of 1998, people felt that that was a destination in itself, that that was an end goal. But in fact, it was the beginning. So our peace agreement, the Good Friday or Belfast Agreement of 98, has in some way created stability, but it's also created feelings of uncertainty and insecurity, particularly for the Protestant Unionist community. So while Northern Ireland in the legality has remained as part of the United Kingdom, as part of Great Britain, there is a feeling of a change in the air, that winners and losers, that the Irish nationalist Catholic community are starting to make gains. So that this is about compromise and consensus. So by Catholics coming up or being more educated, having more jobs, etc., has started to threaten what went before. So it's this issue of how do you compromise is extremely significant. So a lot of people are bereaving the known, the familiar, and the certainties. So everything that was a given is now not a given. It's based on more of meritocracy or equality of opportunity rather than you are guaranteed a job because of your religious identity. That is no longer the case. So Northern Ireland being taken out of Britain will not happen, but people are feeling that there's a sense of Britishness in Northern Ireland being eroded. So if you're from the Protestant community, you feel that there's much more of a threat. So for example, at the City Hall in Belfast, it was decided that the Union flag, the British flag, which hung 365 days of the year, which doesn't even happen in England, to be more representative of the community, that it should only be flown on certain days of the year, something like 100 and something days of the year. So the flag democratically was agreed by all parties, most parties, to be flown on certain days. So the flag came down, and that one incident caused absolute mayhem across our society. It caused lots of riots on the streets, people kind of feeling that by the flag coming down was taking away your British identity. Whereas in fact what was trying to happen was it can fly, but it needs to be more representative of the full community. But you can understand, if you were from the Protestant community identifying as being British, you would see that as your identity being eroded to some extent. For young people though, they feel and are made to be the custodians or the ambassadors of culture and tradition. So they're meant to be the defenders of your identity. And when that flag incident happened in Belfast, it wasn't adults that were at the front rioting. The adults moved the young people to the front to fight and defend territory and to attack other communities. And what happens then is that young people then get offences by the police, it goes on their record, and this type of thing. So I think we'll stop just after this slide, but these are other issues. So the conflict does leave all these issues around identity and the threat to identity and whose identity is under threat, but it's also other wider social issues as well at stake. We have significant inequalities along poverty and life expectancy lines. In some areas of Belfast, in North Belfast, a male potentially would die in his early 60s or mid 60s, whereas in South Belfast, which is more affluent, the life expectancy for that male is in the high 70s or early 80s. So there's something wrong in our society along those lines. The highest concentrations of suicide are in Northern Ireland out of the United Kingdom. If you look at the whole of the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland has the highest rates of suicide. But also in Northern Ireland, they're in North and West Belfast, the highest areas of deprivation and social disadvantage. It's a fact that Catholics are more likely to experience significant economic and social disadvantage and have ongoing unemployment and intergenerational unemployment. Catholics are more likely to be unemployed, be in poor health, and outscore on almost every measure of deprivation. Now, this is not a competition of, oh, we're worse off than them. It's a reality that this is a fact, but also that there is poverty and there is underachievement in Protestant working class communities as well. It's just that the statistics and the facts present it like this. There's a lack of investment from employers and businesses in certain areas. So if you come to Belfast, the city centre, at the face of it, it looks brilliant. It looks re-emerging. It's a confident city. And you just go one street back and you see the pockets of poverty and deprivation. There are restrictive mobility to access services for many young people and for parents, whether that be health services or leisure services. And then coming with that is risk and safety. So it's not safe to go to a leisure service because it might be on the other side of the community. And 1 in 5 people in Northern Ireland have a problem with mental health and this transgenerational trauma transmission. But ironically, in surveys, Northern Ireland and Belfast is shown to be the happiest place in the United Kingdom or something, and yet there's this severe anxiety which is borne out every day in how we go about our lives. I think we'll stop there, Aylin, and we'll continue later.
Yes, I'm sure the audience also has many questions to ask you. Thank you for this wonderful introduction. Maybe I can start with a question before the audience gets ready. Okay? From your presentation, we got a wonderful picture about how the youth feels about the conflict in Ireland. What I'm curious about is your organization brings together Protestant and Catholic people from different communities, and you gave us also the picture of how these communities are segregated, how interaction between these communities is so challenging. How do you bring this youth together? How do you approach them? And how do these young people who come to your community see you? I mean, do they feel safe? Do they feel threatened at first? How do you seduce them to come to your community?
Okay.
I mean, to your organization.
Thanks, Lady. The building that we have in Belfast, for example, is a purposeful built building in the city centre in what would be seen as a more neutral or shared space. So, for example, 450 young people would come through our doors in that building in Belfast every week. So those young people come because we have an established programme of activities that those young people come to on a regular basis, and they see it as a safe space for them to come to. And they're both from the Protestant community and Catholic. And probably just as important as that, they come from different minority communities as well, such as Polish community, Romanian community. So young people are seeing it as a place of difference, not necessarily as a place of sameness. Often the rhetoric in Northern Ireland is about, we're all the same, we should, we're all the same and we should just get on with it. And we are not all the same. There's no beauty in sameness, only difference. So I think our building creates this sort of space where young people can come together. They actually do ask each other, are you a Catholic or a Protestant? But feel safe to do that in our building. That aside, we work with 15,000 young people per year, so it's not just in that building. We have to proactively work with community leaders and gatekeepers, and we'll come back to that probably, gatekeepers, to engage with young people and to help young people engage in a wide range of programs. And those programs can start off with music, drama, art, but they also are more issue-based programs as well, about helping young people to explore contentious issues in a creative way and appealing to young people's learning styles. So it's not all dialogue, it can be through creative arts and expression and things like this. It's very challenging work. It takes an awful lot of effort over many, many years. Our organisation has been going for 75 years, so we would have credibility and respect among a lot of communities over the years who know that we deliver and who know that we listen and that we don't parachute into their communities and try and impose our liberal ideologies. It's about taking time to understand the need, to identify the local actors, and together to co-design and co-create programs with that community.
To the audience.
Thank you very much, sir, for a very interesting presentation so far. I have a couple of questions, if I'm allowed. One is about, you said peace lines, and I was seeing walls, and I wasn't really sure what I was seeing. But you mentioned that they are walls, but they might also be other things. If you could please talk a little bit more about what they are, who came up with the word peace line, and how it gets regulated, who decides where it goes and how. And my second question is, besides transgenerational transference of these norms, do those norms also exist among communities that have emigrated? Is there such a thing as Irish diaspora or immigrants from Northern Ireland who exist in the same space and who take these prejudices with them outside in new countries, maybe even in the UK or US, Canada, wherever they end up?
Okay,
thank you, sir.
Two good questions as well. The peace lines are, in fact, as we spoke today about Aylin as well, they're not peace lines at all, they're peace divides. And how a wall can be seen as peaceful is beyond me. So it's that sort of question of the absence of violence does not mean you have a peaceful society. So we have not the same sort of violence, but we have these physical divides that are called peace walls. And I think that is strategic by the Northern Ireland office and government who named them in the first place, and for the local communities not to see it as a divide but as protecting them. It's some sort of peaceful protection because they are literally either side of the wall. Now, if you ask the people in those communities, do you want that wall taken down? The resounding answer would probably be no, to be fair, that it's not time to take the wall down, because the minute the wall would come down, they are vulnerable to attack. People who don't live in those neighbourhoods are very quick to say, take all the walls down, we should have no more walls, and I understand that language, and we shouldn't have walls, but if you live there, you need to feel safe. So I totally agree with you. I can't see how they're called peace walls and peace lines because they're maintaining the peace.
When did they first come up?
Sorry. From 1968, from when the conflict really first kicked off after a civil rights march and parade, where Catholics and allies from the Protestant community were saying Catholics need to have the same opportunities, have access to education, have access to employment, be able to vote, which at that time you weren't. So that civil rights march sort of in some way, in quite a significant way, contributed to, in West Belfast, between the Shankill Road and the Falls Road, to the first fights on a street where Protestants and Catholics lived together, and by that, Bombay Street, and ironically called Bombay, when I think about that. That's the first time I've thought about that, but yeah, Bombay. So, and ever since, that community has been divided, so since 1968, 1969. So the second question, I think, is about prejudice. For example, I know in my own research I heard about young Northern Irish people who identified as Catholic going over to work in London at the age of 19, 20. And when they met other young people from Northern Ireland, they were still sussing them out, even though it was in a different context. So they were still kind of going, oh, where are you from? And, you know, all the usual identifiers to try and, because it's that thing of, I need to feel safe. What will I talk with you about? I don't want to leave myself exposed, even though you're in a different country. But I also do agree with Irish or Catholics aren't necessarily always victims either. When they go to other countries, they can be equally as prejudiced, if not as more so prejudiced. And we need just need to look to American, you know, the role of the Irish in America, after being treated so brutally by the British at that time of colonialism, go and do the same thing in the United States.
Okay.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I want to ask that this type of separation still exists in Muslim community right now, and still they are killing each other because of their religious point of view. I want to ask that, do you think this type of separations coming from the religion or different source, you may think? Can we think like this? If there is no religion, we don't see this type of separations. Or why people believing in same religion but fighting each other because of their religious background, because they are believing same religion. I want to ask that.
Complicated one. I suppose it's that interplay between religion, national identity, territory. You know, in Northern Ireland, there's a firstness. Who were the original ancestors? Who was here first? You know, and the Irish community would say, we were here first, this is our land, whereas the Scottish settlers who were brought over by the United Kingdom and Britain, you know, when they arrived, they feel now that that's their territory, that it had been given to them as part of an agreement, and they feel that that's their territory. So, for example, in terms of land and selling land, rural land in the farming community, only 12% of land is sold to the opposite religion, to the opposite community, because land is about territory, and territory becomes about majoritarianism, this type of thing. So I think it's an intersection between religion, politics, and territory, land to some degree. I also think that religion, organised religion, in some way, not as to blame, but plays its part in the conflict and has played its part in maintaining the conflict. The schools, when we talk about the 94% of schools that are separate, are controlled by the church. So the church is playing a role in keeping separation. So I think it's hard to kind of say that the church don't play a role. But I think it's been misunderstood in our context in Northern Ireland that it's about Protestant and Catholic. And when we in fact, of course, are Christian, it's not about that at all. And young people are not identifying as Protestant or Catholic. So if you ask them in monitoring forums, are you a Protestant or Catholic, they identify neither. Yeah. So it's not the religion now for young people that's the divide. It's this identity of who are you and which side are you on. And it's not, are you on the Protestant side or the Catholic side? It's become more, are you on the British side or are you on the Irish side?
Complicated.
Soracaktım ben. İngiltere'nin Avrupa Birliği'nden ayrılması.
I wanted to ask a question about Brexit. Can you hear me? Yes, my question is about Brexit. After Brexit, what could happen? Can you please give us further information about what could happen in Northern Ireland after Brexit?
Okay. Yeah, I suppose one of the first things is the physicality of a border is a reality. The freedom of movement on the island of Ireland. We move about Ireland north and south as Nayat did when she came to visit, freely. That will no longer be the case when Brexit happens. So Northern Ireland will be in the United Kingdom and will not be part of the European Union. So we have to have some sort of border with the European Union country, which unfortunately in that instance is in Ireland. The Unionist Protestant loyalist community would want that the Republic of Ireland also withdraws from the European Union. So if the Republic of Ireland withdraws from the European Union, then we have two countries that are not in the European Union and who can cooperate together. That's not going to happen, by the way, but that's a proposal. Another proposal is that down the Irish Sea, that there would be a border of some sort down the Irish Sea, and most nationalist Catholic Republicans would welcome that to some degree because it would mean that there's no border on the island of Ireland. The border is in the sea between the United Kingdom and Ireland. But if you're from the Protestant Unionist Loyalist side of the house, you do not want that border because that disconnects you from the United Kingdom. So all of a sudden the United Kingdom is split, Scotland, England and Wales, with Northern Ireland kind of a border here. So this is a very, very tricky issue. On another point, a lot of our funding in terms of civic society and the third sector, the voluntary NGOs, comes from Europe. Our money comes from the European Regional Development Fund. My job of 21 years has been based on peace funding. Piece 1, Piece 2, Piece 2 extension, Piece 3, Piece 4. So we're in Piece 4 at the moment. And it's not about keeping me in a job, it's about maintaining the work at grassroots level, but it's also about how we're not just at grassroots level, but middle level leadership, influencing top level leadership as well. One important thing I meant to say at the start is currently in Northern Ireland we have no government. So we have a devolved administration of politicians where we have what is the word again? I've forgotten, but it's basically where we have power sharing based on the two opposing factions. So we have the DUP, the Democratic Unionist Party, who represent extreme unionism, so union with Britain. On this side we have Sinn Féin, who are totally in favour of a reunification of Ireland. So consociationalism. So we have a consociational government, so it's set up with the two opposing factors to work together, and we don't have a working government. Last year it collapsed over a heating scandal and corruption, as we spoke earlier, Aylin, as well. So corruption, accusations of corruption to the Democratic Unionist Party have led to our government falling. So we have nobody in government to help at one of the most significant changes possibly in our history. Written into our constitution is the option to have a border poll, and a border poll is where the people of Ireland, North and South, can vote on the reunification of Ireland. So with Brexit coming in, and the implications of that is not, it might help at some point in the future, not help, but might contribute to a reunification, which is certainly not what the DUP ever intended from their strategy.
Okay.
Oh, it's a packet again.
Öncelikle merhaba.
First of all, hello, good evening. Welcome to Turkey. And thank you very much for your presentation. My question is the following. In the first short presentation, initial part, you said in 1998, the Good Friday Agreement, by the way, we will celebrate its 20th anniversary, and today in Turkey, when we talk about peace, whenever there is a peace process in Turkey, we always talk about your model because it's an exemplary model, peace model in Ireland. It's always shown as an example around the world. But from your first initial statements, what I can understand is that actually there is a crisis. There is an ongoing crisis. It's not like as we know it. You tried to say that. And Gary Adams, the leader of Sinn Féin, was, I think, taken in detention in Ireland, and he's still seen as a terrorist after all these things. Is that true? That's what I want to ask. Is he still seen like a terrorist?
So, thank you for the welcome to Turkey as well. I can sing Bana Bana, Bana Bana. But anyway, that was 1980 something. Yeah, there is a crisis. I think that people are, first of all, in terms of our politicians and the political government, having no government for over 1 year, issues along the lines of poverty and social issues are not being addressed by our government. So we now have direct rule from Westminster in London, who determine what happens in Northern Ireland. So there's a democratic deficit there, number one. Our politicians from the political parties are totally opposed, and both of those parties, the DUP and Sinn Féin, have had some links in the past to different militant activity. So the one we speak about is obviously with Sinn Féin and Gerry Adams and his connection to the IRA, and Martin McGuinness as well. They very clearly denounce the violence and have moved a long way from it. But people's psychology and psyche will never accept that, and will always look at paramilitary activity as the problem, not in terms of state activity and state militant behaviours as a problem. So I think there's a complexity of trying to, not to go, it's your fault, but the British Army played their role in the killings of innocent civilians, as did the paramilitary groups of the IRA, the UVF, the UDA, in terms of the loyalist side. But it's always looked at in terms of Sinn Féin, that Sinn Féin are intrinsically linked to paramilitary activity, and still are. There may be some small element to that, but it's exactly the same on the other side. So we have paramilitary groups that are growing in this unrest, in this period of unrest and lack of government, coupled with lack of employment, lack of housing, young men in particular have no sense of purpose, not interested in education, no jobs. So they get their kudos or their status from local community militant roles of drug, often involved in drugs, but also in terms of being the defender of the community. And that's rising. And I'm all on for uprising, but not that type of uprising, and supporting more non-violent type behaviour. If a border comes into play in in Northern Ireland context, on the border area, I think we will see a lot of militant activity disguised as other things, disguised as like community control, community policing, but it will actually be more militant in its nature, unfortunately. But the Good Friday Agreement in 1998 was also followed by other agreements, like the Hillsborough Agreement, with the Fresh Start Agreement, St Andrews Agreement. So it wasn't just one agreement, it's been refined as we have moved along. And I have heard just very, very recently from people in our sector who actually want to scrap the Good Friday Agreement and don't believe that it's working. And in fact, if you look at statistics, the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, while we had 70-something percent, 72% voted in the referendum for the Good Friday Agreement, those numbers, if you take it to Protestant to Catholic, it was Catholics in the largest numbers in the majority voted for the Good Friday Agreement. Lots, high percentages, maybe high 40s percentages did not endorse the Good Friday Agreement. So, and coupled with that, there's a narrowing of the gap between statistics between Protestant and Catholic. So for example, it was something like 48% Protestant, 46% Catholic, and then other. But now that's getting closer and closer. And if we look at the statistics, it shows us that those over the age of 40, in the majority, are from the Protestant Unionist Loyalist community. When we go under 40, 40 right down, the majority is in the Catholic nationalist community. So that also contributes to anxiety and fear. No problem.
Arkada. Önce
Turn it off.
I will ask in English now.
Oh,
I can ask in Turkish if you want. You said 94% of the children are separated. I'm curious about the 6%. Who are they, and are they getting a secular education, or are they non-Irish, and are they the intellectual elite's children, or, you know?
yeah. Okay.
And I have one more question. There are obviously people like you who are also, like, you're working for peace and for understanding each other. And how is life for that people? Who, like, is there a community like that? You know,
Okay.
I'm just curious, how are you perceived? How can you, because you said like terrible things, like you can't even cross the border, you can't even, you have to change your name. And how come you can do the things you're doing? Who are
I'm a
those
magician.
people?
No, yeah, I'll come to that. So first question about integrated education. Yes, 6% of our schools are integrated and they are secular. They're non-religious. However, the young people can go to those schools and practice their Catholic faith or Protestant faith, but not just Christianity, it's other religions as well are very welcome in those integrated schools. But, and I should be an advocate for integrated education, they've only been around since the 1980s and still haven't really grown too much. But research into children in that integrated school situation show that in the classroom, so say this is the classroom, they've analysed who sat where in the classroom. So at the age of 11 in the classroom, this little group of Catholics grouped together in the classroom. This little group of Protestants grouped together in the classroom. They also carried out the same survey then 5 years later, and it was pretty much the same. So there wasn't much movement of interacting necessarily or being with, you know, young people from a different community. To some degree I understand that, because this little group of Catholics are probably going back to the same community on the same bus type thing as well. So there wasn't much interaction of sort. That's problem number one. Problem number two, it's, do you know the saying, the elephant in the room? Yeah, so is never talked about at an integrated school. It's let's not talk about it. Let's keep it here. Keep the lid on it very clearly, because we don't want to create that type of society. Let's talk about everything else. Let's talk about having a brilliant society and being all peace-loving, la-di-da-di-da, but not talk about the problem. So for me, that's an issue. A third thing would be when the young people are asked, when they come out of the integrated school, would you send your own children to an integrated school? The majority say no. I would send them to a good school. So which would imply that the integrated school doesn't have the same success rates in terms of its educational achievement. However, I do believe, I do think we need to look at it, and we partner with the Integrated Education Fund to help promote integration, to be fair. But another interesting statistic, Queen's University Belfast carry out with Ulster University a survey about who is leaving Northern Ireland, who is leaving the country and not coming back. And there were 3 groups of people. Initially, it was thought that Protestant young people were leaving to better educate themselves and not come back. They were going to Scotland and England. But when the survey was carried out, it showed that the groups of young people who weren't coming back went to integrated school, had parents from mixed family, mixed religion, or were from the LGBTQ community. So that would say to me that Northern Ireland is a very conservative society and doesn't particularly celebrate integration, difference, diversity, that type of thing. And then the second question was about, movement and mobility. Yeah, I do think I am fortunate in my job to be able to move about, and we work across the Irish Isles, we work across the British Irish Isles. When I was younger, I didn't have that freedom. So I think it's an age thing, getting older. I think it's like my job, that type of thing. But it's not that young people are stuck in their communities. They do move about, but poverty, that double sentence of poverty, restricts young people's movement, but also their identity. It's that, again, just in case. I remember working in one part of Belfast, and young men, so Belfast is surrounded by the Cave Hill and the Blacks Mountain, and it's like only a couple of miles away. And the young men were saying to me, one day I hope to go see what's on the other side of that hill. And I thought, really? And they had never been to the other side of the hill, just for fear. They were really, really frightened. And there was nothing to be frightened of. It was other towns and villages and things like that. But it was just this aspiration to go and see what was there. So yeah, there are very real restrictions on young people, but also it's about perceptions and feeling safe. Do I feel safe to do that? And by the way, I don't feel safe. I was talking today to Aylin, and I'm in the process of buying a new house. And my number one thing is to think about my safety, and not to be naive. So I'm from the Catholic community. No, I'm joking. But I am from the Catholic community, and it would be very naive of me to go and buy a house in a Protestant community, as much as I would like to, because I will probably get my windows put through, I will get death threats. So it doesn't make sense, and you need to think about your safety. So if people like me, a peace champion and a peace builder, and I choose to live in a community mostly of my own people, am I really a peace builder? Do you know, I might have movement, but it's very challenging.
Bu okulların ayrı.
Well, the segregation of schools and young people not meeting each other up to a certain age and having no communication at all, and you mentioned the consequences thereof. What I'm curious about is, during the most intense times of conflict, and when there were the highest number of lives lost, those people who witnessed that, and those who acquired prejudices towards the other side from their parents or previous generations, whose prejudice is harder to break? Is it for those who witnessed it firsthand, or those who acquired these prejudices transgenerationally?
Oh. Again, complicated. I think for those who experience the conflict firsthand, there has been to some degree reconciliation programs of understanding, bringing together victims and survivors, and bringing together the paramilitary groups who are now named reintegration. So those are people who have been in prison, who were prisoners of war. So to some degree there has been an effort to work at those who have experienced it firsthand. I think when you've experienced the conflict at first hand and you've had death in your family and murder and atrocity, that is so strong for you that to be able to forgive is very difficult. And people are also searching for the truth, you know, and whether that be the truth about a missing loved one that disappeared, you know, who have just disappeared out of Northern Irish society because they've been taken by the British state, they've been taken by the Irish Republican Army or whoever, and they've never been found, so they've never been buried. So people are searching for truth and justice, and forgiveness can be very, very difficult as well. I think for the younger people who experience then that transgenerational trauma, I think that is as real for them, but they don't have the same sort of context of the everyday world. You know, they're not seeing a policeman or somebody in the army with a gun standing at the end of the street. So, but they're still experiencing that anxiety and that fear that their parents continually say to them. Now, I'm not a parent, but I know what my parents said to me, you know, and they were like, you're not going there, or be careful, and things like that. So I'm not sure where the emphasis of lies in terms of who has more, you know, not hurt to who has more to experience or whatever, but I think for young people it's still very difficult, and to see their parents suffer, to see their parents on medication, and to hear stories of the past being told and retold, and going to culture nights, which aren't really culture nights, they're about celebrating, as I said earlier, celebrating victories over one another, and I'm not sure that narrative is the best, to be honest. How are we for time? Okay.
Thank you. I wonder, is teaching history is an issue because of the sectarian wars and other conflicts and so on? Is it varies between the schools, between the Catholic schools and the others, and how is that affecting? Is it covered? I mean, yeah.
Okay. Yep. So, in terms of history, if you go to a Catholic school, you get Irish history. It's as simple as this. You get Irish history of like champions and things, and like mystical people, like Cuchulainn the Brave, you know, going back into whatever century, the 9th century and things like this, 10th century. So you're learning an Irish history, and also then about the role of Britain in Ireland. If you go to a Protestant school, you're being taught a British history about the monarchy and Tudors and the Lancastrians and this type of thing. So that's what you're learning. But a really good, in terms of the curriculum, the school's curriculum, a few years back, the Council for Curriculum and Examinations and Assessment introduced government and politics. And I think that has started to change things a little bit, because that is a taught curriculum for all schools, and they have to follow the same curriculum, and it's looking at how your society is constituted, and you're learning about political parties, representation, you're learning about, as well, Irish politics, you're also looking at, not that this is great, but American politics perhaps, and you're also looking at British politics. So I think in that mix is quite good. So it's not history, but tied in with it is a little bit of history and how it came about. So I think that might go some way to changing things a little bit, even though we have no political government, unfortunately. So, and it's not all doom and gloom, and I was hoping to kind of give some positive pictures as well, because there are really good examples of positive practice and progressive movements of young people as well we might get to touch on, but...
Maybe one more question and then you might... Okay.
Merhabalar, hoş geldiniz.
Hello and welcome, first of all. Your work is truly valuable, and I find it valuable in that it helps dialogue and mutual understanding. And the omission, conflict, dominant and dominated societies, communities, in that context it's also very valuable. I'm not just saying this as a side, but in order to understand the other side, I think it could be far beneficial to talk to the other side. I mean, when we look at our country, we look at the Alawites, Sunnis, Kurds, Turks, and the religious and secular sides, if you will. Unfortunately, still in our country, Armenians, I mean, the word Armenian is used as an insult. Maybe when you talk about it here, it could serve as a segue into the other side to bring them into dialogue. This is just my humble recommendation. And my question is, my friend already asked a question about history. What I want to know is, as an educator, it could be in the phrasing or the pictures used in textbooks. Did you do any work on the content of textbooks? And also, I want to know about the indoctrination, because the history is actually about relaying ideologies onto future generations. It is particularly states that do this, that utilize history in that way. And another thing I'm curious about dialogue, I was a little bit late, maybe I missed this, but I leave it to you if you want to talk about it. But points of commonality of Protestants and Catholics, or the British and the Irish, what are the common points? And then what are the points of conflict in dialogue? How can they tell one another apart? That's what I want to know. And there was another question in line with that. The sides of conflict, or the separated sides, when they come together to reconcile, what are the things that they cannot forgive? And I think I've asked too many questions back to back. Should I finish? I have two more, but I do apologize. There was a pile-up. Because I have to find out about this as someone who wants to make peace, who wants to reconcile and pass this on to the children as an educator. So please excuse my curiosity. And I'm also, with regards to your work, I'm also curious about the methodology, strategies, and tactics. Do you think they're true? I mean, they're universal, they're true for all regions, or can they be adapted to different regions? And the final question, okay, for both sides of the conflict, it could be economical, political, what are their points of, or it could also be civil disobedience, for example, the Protestants or the British against the Catholics or the Irish, and the Irish against maybe as a dominated people in the past. What are their, I mean, do they still have disobedience against the British? I'm sorry for the barrage of questions, but I'm curious about the answers. Thank you.
Thank you. Bad man. So, in some instances there's a lot of denial and distancing and habituation is what I would say across the islands, both Britain and Ireland. So some people deny that there even was a problem, or in denial that it's nothing to do with us, it's not our responsibility, or they're immune to it in some sort of way. The situations I talk about mostly are habituation, those who live with it on an ongoing basis and who continually question it and think about it, and whether it be about Protestant Catholic, whether it be about British-Irish relationships. So habituation, you're living with it every day. But a lot of people distance themselves from it as well and have become apathetic and believe that things are never going to change. Que sera, sera. What's the point? Don't turn out to vote, whether it be in referendums. In Northern Ireland, I have to say, not so much the Republic. The Republic of Ireland has made much, much more social gain and has changed the landscape of how Ireland looks to the world than it did 30 years ago. So Irish society would be seen as very Irish Catholic, very conservative, very backward. Now in Irish society, it's much more progressive. It's had a referendum on marriage equality, which went through, on abortion. It's becoming a much more outward-looking society. Whereas when we move to the Northern Ireland context, it's becoming more and more backward, and we're sliding backwards into more prejudice, just not looking outwards and reaching out to difference. So that's just a reality to state. I'm just trying to think of all your other points that you were making. Can you remind me of one? The commonalities, yeah. I think that there has been much work on at a political level. The British Irish Parliamentary Assembly are a group of people, of political representatives who meet across Britain and Ireland, whether you're in the north of Ireland or whether you're in the Republic of Ireland and in Great Britain. So they come together as a group called BIPA, as an assembly to look at issues affecting each of the countries. So I think that's a really positive thing, that at political level they're talking with one another, whereas in the past that wouldn't have happened. But equivalent to that as well is a BIPA, British Irish Parliamentary Assembly Youth. So we have young people from Northern Ireland, young people from the Republic of Ireland, Scotland, Wales and England, who all then meet with that adult assembly, and they bring the youth issues into that place. So complementary to that British-Irish relationship that way, we also have a North-South Ministerial Council on the island of Ireland. And that North-South Ministerial Council try to ensure that there's movement north and south, economically, socially, mobility of young people, opportunities, etc. So I think those two groups for me politically are really good in terms of trying to find out the commonalities. How can we work towards the common good, pursuing the common good together, and as I say, whether that's economics or social issues, environmental or whatever. At civic society level, I think that's under threat. We do, in the north of Ireland, Northern Ireland, we don't have a citizens' assembly where citizens can be like, not elected, but like in a lottery type situation, be chosen to reflect everyday citizens' issues. So we don't have that, whereas the south of Ireland do have a citizens' assembly. So people are chosen randomly in the population. They come together, they talk about things in common, they talk about things in difference, and where things need to move forward. So that's something we hope that we can introduce in Northern Ireland. But commonality is okay, but there is an emphasis on sameness is just I think common issues is a good thing, but a rhetoric of all being the same, though, is just a bit of a concern for me on that one. Let's go. Okay, so so it's not all doom and gloom. So I'll just talk us through some things that are going on. So one of my second questions was then, not just about the impact of the conflict on young people, but how do young people see themselves as change agents? Do they believe in social change? And is that something that they feel doable and realistic? So, for example, young people said, we need constructive discussions, not just engagement. So for me, that's really important. Young people are saying, we're really keen to come together and to meet with the other young people from another community, but we want to have real and meaningful conversations, and whether that be about common issues or social issues or issues of difference and identity, that's one of the things they were looking for. We need to let Protestants and Catholics socialise together. So for the most part, young Protestants and Catholics have separate sports. There are separate sports. If you play hockey, you're more likely to be Protestant. If you play Gaelic football or hurling, you're more likely to be Catholic. So young people are saying, we actually want to do these things. We want to come together and we want to socialise together. on a slightly negative, but it's not up to us to do anything. You know, this is your responsibility. We need you to make that change. But on another side, a young person, there's a lot more we can do. You just don't want to stop. I think we should keep going until we're sick of trying. So I really love, and I can remember that young person as they spoke. They'd been involved in a peer research program where young people were researching issues and creating a manifesto to present to government about peace building. And that was a young woman, and she just wanted to keep going and going and going, year in, year out. And I just loved her hope and determination and her conviction that we can make it a better place. Slightly interesting in some of the young people as agents have changed. They were able to connect to a global conscience about global issues as well as local issues, and they were more able to think about how they could create local change than global change. They didn't feel connected into a global world, and I'm not sure if that's because we're on an island or what the rationale or reason for that is, but they didn't really think, they knew about things happening in other parts of the world, but didn't see how they could play a role in the change. So they were mostly thinking about the change in Irish society. But they talked about politicians should be organising youth group discussions. So when Brexit, for example, first came up, I was still doing my research, and young people had no idea what the hell that meant. And it was like, what is Brexit? We keep hearing the word over and over and over again. We don't know anything about it. So there was something about how we inform and educate our young people. For the most part, I do think that young people care about social issues. They care about the environment. They care, certainly in Northern Ireland, about LGBT issues. Their friends are LGBT, and they cannot understand why we have laws which prevent LGBT equality. For example, gay men can't give blood. What's the problem with that? And young people just don't understand why we haven't progressed. So I do think that young people, though, however, also imitate previous generations of political parties and things like that. So young people are very keen in some ways to be involved in politics, and you would hear them say, we're a different era. We're different young people. We're a new generation. We're not like the ones that have gone before. I would hope that that's true. There are some instances on television programs where we see young people replicating old behaviours of their predecessors, of the people that they saw in government, shouting each other down, not having a healthy, vibrant clash of difference, but just total disrespect and putting down the other party or the other community. So I hope that that will change. You know, I'm not sure how established youth work as a profession would be necessarily in Turkey. You know, it's certainly been something, it's an education order from 1972 in Northern Ireland, so we see youth work as non-formal education and informal education, and we have professional youth workers, like such as our organisation, but we also rely on volunteers, large numbers of volunteers to support us to do the work, because not everybody's paid, and also we want to support people who want to create change as well. So Wiley notes that youth work can provide safe spaces, which is really important, because why would you enter into something if it wasn't safe? But it's not just physically safe, it's psychologically and mentally safe as well, for experiential learning among young people. Hughes and Knox also talks about community relations. So we've had different policies in Northern Ireland. The most recent one was CRED, Community Relations and Equality and Diversity. But community relations is ultimately about meaningful interaction between Protestants and Catholics at intergroup level. So our education policy at this minute in time talks about shared education in youth work. So every youth work organisation, as it moves forward, will have to demonstrate how is it nurturing youth activism, how is it nurturing social action, how is it nurturing interaction and engagement between young people from different communities. So it will be no longer good enough to go, I just work with Catholics and I'm a great youth worker and we do really good work. That's not good enough. We will now have to demonstrate where we kind of encouraging young people to meet with one another. So education is really important, and youth work, you know, prides itself on recognizing injustices and kind of trying to address those injustices, whatever they might be. So that social educational vision is really important in youth work. However, I would say that a lot of those coming out of university in Ulster, not every university, kind of maybe don't accept the political challenge of being a youth worker. They don't recognise the social change as part of their the fabric of their profession. It's much more about the individual intervention with each young person. And we have been very much impacted by more liberal ideologies of outcomes-based accountability and the individualisation of the young people that we're working with, as opposed to collectives and group. And that's just something we really need to pay attention to, that doesn't become under threat. Very much it's about sort of Freire type, Paulo Freire, in terms of, you know, moving from a naive consciousness and a magical consciousness to a critical consciousness, where we're encouraging both those working with young people and young people themselves to be more sensitive to injustices, to have a critical mind, to develop curiosity, to ask questions, to not just accept that's the way it is, to not just accept que sera, sera. We have the power, you have the power to actually infiltrate that change in ways that you can. So we believe that sensitization to oppression helps lead to a commitment to action, and we have lots of different examples of that, where young people are doing things in their local communities, social action projects to raise awareness of gender inequality, of LGBT inequalities, but also issues around poverty as well, and to bring that into the forefront of people's minds. And it's really just a willingness to go on a journey together. So I've sort of talked a little bit about liberal ideologies and things, and McGinty here would talk about peace building, bureaucratic, technocratic approaches to how we go about it. So for example, currently we're funded through SEUPB, which is through the European Regional Development Fund for our peace work, but in some respect the funding body has given us the parameters of what it is that we can do. So they tell us, as a professional youth work organisation, this is how you will work with young people over a 6-month period, 18 hours per week, looking at personal development, good relations and citizenship. So they're telling us what to do. We're not creating that with them. So it's still good work, but it's just to be cautious of the ideology and what is being pushed to us rather than the other way. So a quote here from McGinty was saying, "It becomes peace from IKEA, a flat pack peace made from standardized components, minimizing the space for organic, local, traditional or indigenous contributions to peacemaking." So basically, I suppose you get the understanding there. You know, we need to involve local indigenous people, local actors with local knowledge who understand their context. I come from a regional organisation, so it's about how does the regional and the local work together, because we come with different insights. We can help the local infiltrate the policy. We can also help the policy understand the local need. So it's how we work together, and I suppose not be dictated to. So the role of local actors, local knowledge as an asset, more participatory and locally owned. So from a youth work perspective, we hope that young people co-design our programs with us and are co-owners of those programs. And as I said earlier, just these are really key words, but Emily Stanton talks about having trustworthiness in your approach, that you need to be trustworthy, that the community and the young people trust you, and that it's built on integrity, credibility, inclusivity, transparency and accountability. Now this all seems lovely. La-di-da, here we are, transparent, we're inclusive, we're accountable. However, some community gatekeepers are not, at this level, grassroots civic leadership level, are not always so welcoming to our interventions as well. So some gatekeepers can be very clear. We're being very transparent about what we're trying to do, and a gatekeeper can very quickly close the door on what we're doing. So just to bring us to a sort of close, my research ultimately indicated and showed 100% that peace had fallen off the agenda in Northern Ireland. So when we talk about the Good Friday Agreement being an exemplar, and that's interesting, in 1998, 10 years later as my research started, peace interventions started to fall off the radar, as if we had reached a conclusion and we didn't need to do any work anymore as practitioners or as educationalists. So my research very, very quickly, both from young people and from the practitioner, showed that peace building was not on the agenda, or was not top of the agenda, that type of rhetoric. So concurrently, I had also been reading, in terms of literature, about the United Nations Agenda for Peace from the 1990s, and how at a United Nations level there is that effort to drive peace. And we can be critical of that, but it's there. So that got me looking at my findings to think about how do we develop an agenda for peace through youth work. So I only want to touch on it very quickly because we don't have the time, but basically Agenda for Peace is an acronym. So the letters of the word agenda stand for something. So my research showed that the letter A, first of all, was about assessment of need and appetite to act. So that's basically indicating that both young people and worker acknowledge we still live in conflict. We still have a divided society. The absence of conflict is not good enough, and we need to insist that we will never return there. The assessment of need, again, like McGuinty, is about local ownership and having organic, indigenous people identifying that need and identifying the solutions to that need. A lot of people would say, if it's not broke, don't fix it. There's no need to fix it. But it is broke, so we do need to fix it. And that's what's going on at the assessment of need, appetite to act. So like we heard from Frere, it's like once you have consciousness and you have that critical consciousness, it should inspire you into action. So if I know at the need level there's something in my community is not right, it should inspire collective action. So that's number one in terms of A. G is about getting buy-in, and I think this is really challenging actually, because I come from an era of late 1980s, 1990s, where this was really a powerful, progressive social movement to be part of, peace building, and to be part of youth work. It isn't really anymore. It doesn't look cool. It's like, actually looks boring, and it looks like you're a do-gooder. You're like jumping around, la-di-da, let's have peace, peace and love, love and peace. There's something about rebranding, about the hook. How do we actually, a lot of the community groups at the minute don't understand. When we talk about peace, they're like, what? What does that actually mean? What does that look like at real level? So there's something about how we actually get the buy-in, the pitch, the hook, the branding, to get the buy-in of the local people, but also how do we get the gatekeepers in local communities to buy in as well and have a shared vision. So E is really about the exploration and depth. So you've assessed the need, you've got the hook and people bought into it, and you've started to build relationships. So it's about what issues are you going to be exploring together with the community. So it's about asking the hard questions. It's about having the content that is worth discussing. It is about myth busting, and it is about developing curiosity. So at this level, it's much more than just getting together. It is about addressing really challenging issues that you might never have explored together. The new relationships, so this is about, so you will have came together, you will have built new relationships through contact, but it's about trying to build meaningful and sustained relationships. How can those relationships continue beyond the professional intervention? How can young people come together and mix and mingle and have a really positive encounter with one another? And where young people can have and appreciate the joy of difference, where they can actually love being together with people who are different and be at ease with that as well. So that's what's going on at N. So D is really important. I don't know where this is at in your society, but a lot of the time the work is kind of very humble, and it's not being celebrated, and people don't really know what's going on. So it's really important that as peace builders that we document the learning from our projects, and that young people in particular are presenting the narrative, that it's not me standing here, I am who I am today, but that young people can stand and they can go, this is what we did, and this is the learning that took place, and this is what I'm going to do. So it's really important that we actually document the outcomes for the individual, for the interpersonal, the community, and wider society, and also share our ideas and resources. I think that's been implicated a little bit in Northern Ireland. So A is Allies for Further Action. So you've gone through this sort of process, but it doesn't just end there, that it's about building on that and finding other people that you can join in with the world. So for example, I now feel connected to Hrant Dink Foundation, so this will not be the end of the journey. I feel like we are allies for action. So likewise for young people, who else can they connect in with across the globe as well, and be part of something bigger and be disruptors in society. Somebody said something about being disruptors and uprising, and I think a healthy disruption is not necessarily a bad thing. So we need to consider, I suppose, fundamentally, what are those triggers to youth activism? How do we get young people engaged and make it meaningful and more creative? Thank you. We've probably gone over time.
Much for this beautiful introduction and the hopeful ending too. Despite all the challenges, we still have something to look forward to, I guess. And I think we'll stop here. Thank you for coming. İyi ki geldiniz. Yep. Teşekkür ederiz.
And yes. Thank you everybody as well for being here this evening as well. Thank you.
Teşekkürler.